Rome in the late 2nd century BCE was a republic in turmoil. Its empire stretched farther than its political institutions could manage, and its greatest generals were beginning to overshadow the Senate. In this world of shifting power, a man emerged from obscurity, destined to terrify Rome as much as her enemies abroad: Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla's beginnings were unremarkable. He was born in 138 BCE into the Cornelii, an ancient patrician family whose wealth had long since faded. His youth was marked not by privilege, but by poverty. Unlike other noble-born Romans, he could not rely on inherited estates or vast fortunes. Instead, he lived simply, sometimes in the company of actors and entertainers, developing an appreciation for the arts and an uncanny ability to charm or intimidate at will. This duality, refined taste and ruthless ambition, would define him for the rest of his life. Sulla's path to prominence began in the army. He first distinguished himself under Gaius Marius, Rome's celebrated general during the Jugurthine War in North Africa, 112 to 105 BCE. Marius, a self-made man who had risen from humble origins, had become a hero of the Roman masses, and Sulla, still relatively unknown, became his subordinate. Yet it was Sulla, not Marius, who engineered Jugurtha's capture. Using guile and negotiation, he convinced King Bocchus of Mauritania to betray Jugurtha, securing Rome's victory. Sulla proudly wore a signet ring depicting the event, a subtle insult to his superior. Marius grew resentful. The seeds of rivalry were planted, seeds that would later erupt into civil war. Despite the tension, Sulla's star continued to rise. He fought with distinction against migrating Germanic tribes and earned the loyalty of soldiers through both strict discipline and calculated generosity. He had the rare ability to balance cruelty and charisma. To enemies, he was merciless. To his soldiers, he was often indulgent, sharing their hardships in camp and rewarding them lavishly after victories. But Sulla's ambitions extended beyond battlefield glory. He was a man who believed in destiny, once boasting that the goddess Fortuna herself favored him. When he looked at Rome's crumbling political order, populares rallying the masses against the Senate, generals turning their legions into instruments of personal power, he saw an opportunity. By the time he was elected consul in 88 BCE, Sulla was no longer the obscure aristocrat who had once mingled with actors. He was a rising force, and when the Senate entrusted him with command against Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus, one of Rome's most dangerous eastern enemies, his fate collided once more with that of Marius. For Marius, now old but still ambitious, could not stand to see his former subordinate rise higher than him. And so, the rivalry that had simmered for decades erupted into open conflict, a conflict that would change Roman history forever.
Civil war and dictatorship.
In 88 BCE, when news reached Rome that Mithridates had massacred tens of thousands of Romans and Italians in Asia Minor, the Senate granted Sulla supreme command of the campaign. But Marius, using his political allies among the populares, seized the decision and had the command transferred to himself. For most Roman generals, such an insult might have ended their career. But Sulla was not most generals. Outraged, he turned to his legions, camped in southern Italy. In an act that shocked the ancient world, Sulla persuaded his soldiers to march on Rome itself. No Roman general had ever done this. The city was sacred, inviolate. Yet Sulla, with cold resolve, broke the taboo. The streets of Rome ran with blood as Sulla's troops stormed the capital. Senators, tribunes, and citizens alike trembled as soldiers clashed in the forum. Marius, forced to flee, barely escaped with his life. Sulla, now master of Rome, restored his command against Mithridates and sailed east. His campaign in Greece and Asia was brutal but effective. Mithridates, though cunning and resourceful, could not withstand the discipline and ferocity of Sulla's forces. Battles at Chaeronea and Orchomenus secured Roman dominance, and though peace terms were negotiated rather than decisive conquest, Sulla had proven his military genius. Yet even as Sulla carved victories in the east, Rome descended into chaos once more. Marius returned from exile, rallied his supporters, and unleashed terror upon the city. Proscriptions, executions, and political purges marked his brief resurgence. When Marius died in 86 BCE, his allies continued the bloodshed. Rome had become a battlefield, its streets echoing with the cries of vengeance. When Sulla returned to Italy in 83 BCE, he brought not only hardened legions, but also a thirst for retribution. Over the next 2 years, he fought a brutal civil war against the Marian faction, culminating in the decisive Battle of the Colline Gate in 82 BCE. Rome's fate hung in the balance, and when Sulla emerged victorious, there was no one left to oppose him. What followed was terror institutionalized. Sulla drew up lists, proscriptions, naming his enemies, both political rivals and personal foes. Anyone on the list was to be killed, their property confiscated, their families ruined. Heads of the executed were displayed in the Forum as grim reminders of Sulla's wrath. The number of deaths is still debated, but thousands perished. The Republic, already fragile, was now ruled by fear. In 82 BCE, Sulla assumed the unprecedented title of dictator for the reconstitution of the Republic. Unlike past dictatorships, which were temporary measures in times of crisis, Sulla's dictatorship had no fixed limit. He rewrote laws, restructured the Senate, curtailed the powers of the tribunes, and sought to restore the dominance of the aristocracy. And yet, beneath the surface of order, lay the reality of tyranny. Senators obeyed out of fear, not loyalty. Citizens whispered his name with dread. To many, Sulla had saved Rome from chaos. To others, he had destroyed the very principles of liberty on which the Republic was built.
The shadow of power.
Then, in a twist as shocking as his rise, Sulla did something no Roman expected. He stepped down. In 79 BCE, after only a few years as dictator, Sulla resigned his absolute powers, restored elections, and retired to his villa in Campania. He claimed his mission was complete. He had reconstituted the Republic. To test the sincerity of his resignation, Sulla walked unguarded through the Forum, daring his enemies to strike. None did. Such was the fear he inspired. In retirement, Sulla lived a life of indulgence. He wrote memoirs, entertained guests with lavish banquets, and surrounded himself with music, theatre, and pleasure. Yet his body, ravaged by years of excess and disease, began to fail him. By 78 BCE, he was dying, covered in sores and ulcers, his once commanding figure reduced to suffering. Before his death, he reflected on his legacy. Some accounts claim he wrote an epitaph declaring that no friend had ever been more faithful, no enemy more bitter. Others suggest he died convinced of his own greatness, boasting that Fortuna had guided him throughout his life. But Rome remembered him with mixed feelings. To his supporters, he was the man who had restored order from chaos, who had defeated Mithridates and reasserted the power of the Senate. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a butcher who had set the precedent for civil war and political violence. In truth, both views held merit. Sulla had strengthened the Senate, but his example, marching on Rome with loyal legions, using terror to secure power, would haunt the Republic. Less than half a century later, Julius Caesar would follow his path, and Rome would never recover. Lucius Cornelius Sulla died in 78 BCE, but the shadow he cast lingered long after. His life was a paradox, a man of refinement who consorted with actors, a general beloved by soldiers yet feared by citizens, a dictator who voluntarily gave up power. He had believed himself favored by Fortuna, and perhaps he was. But his true legacy lay not in divine favor, nor even in his reforms. It lay in the memory of a republic ruled by fear, a republic that had learned, too late, that the line between savior and destroyer can be perilously thin.